Well, good morning. It's good to be back in Grinnell. It's been a long time since I have been here, and so it's just a joy to be here with you. It's really a joy to be able to see the improvements that you've made on your building. It looks just absolutely beautiful, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing here. You know, the appearance of your building says a lot to the community that you're in. It really tells you that you're interested in the work that you're doing here, and that really is good. And I appreciate the opportunity to come and to be with you. And I pray that this will be a good few days for us as we study the Word of God. I will tell you that the lessons that I'm going to be presenting this week are going to be different than I normally do in gospel meetings. I was actually asked to do this in a gospel meeting just a few years ago, and that gospel meeting ultimately did not come about. But I have preached this material before in other places, particularly at South Cullman, and I think it's beneficial because there's a lot of changing taking place among our brethren now with regard to some of these things, and I'll try to highlight some of those as we go through. So this is going to be, for me, a busy day because there's a lot of, not only do I have 3 lessons to present, but there's a lot of material that I want to go through, and some of it I'm going to have to go through so fast that it's going to seem like that we're drinking water out of a fire hose, okay? But I'll try to say enough to make sure that you get the idea. One thing I do want to say is that I am open to any kind of questions that you have. If there are questions about what I present, and I presume that there will be, if you will ask me, I'll be glad to answer either publicly or privately in any way I can. To be able to help you to understand the things that I am talking about. Well, to begin with, it's kind of regrettable, but controversy has always been a part of the Lord's church. And we see this in the Scriptures. Jesus said it would happen. Indeed, in Matthew chapter 10, verse 34, he said, "Do not think that I came to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." Later on down in verse 36, he said, "A man's foes will be even those of his own household." And so Jesus not only taught that it would happen, but he experienced it himself. And then when you come to the church in Acts chapter 2, with it being established, you see that almost from the very beginning there was conflict with the Jews, and then there was conflict with the Gentiles, the Romans, and then there was even conflict among brethren. So it's the kind of thing that has always been a part of the faith of Jesus Christ. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 19 rather, "There must always be factions among you." And in Acts chapter 14 and verse 22, he said, "Through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God." And so don't think that because you're a Christian, you're going to be immune to difficulties, because that is certainly not the case from a lot of different standpoints, as we, I think, have illustrated. In fact, it's kind of interesting to me that when you start reading about what Paul says about the life of a Christian, it is actually framed in warlike terms. For example, Paul begins and ends 1 Timothy chapter 6, kind of bookends, or the book of 1 Timothy, telling Timothy to fight the good fight in chapter 1 and verse 18. Then in the last chapter, chapter 6 and verse 12, he says, "Fight the good fight of faith." So we know that there's going to be conflict, or else it wouldn't be described as a fight. Paul said you've got to put on the whole armor of God in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 11. So that's telling you that we're going to be in some sort of a battle. It is a spiritual battle. Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 4 that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but nevertheless it's a battle. And it's real. And when you are in a spiritual battle, the pain is as real as if you were in a physical battle. It may be of a different nature, but it's still very real. And some of those who have white hair like mine might be able to remember some of the pain of some of these battles. But even so, we've got to, as Paul said, be diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace, Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 3. This morning what we're doing is we're beginning this series on institutionalism. But it has occurred to me, and in fact I know it's so, that there's a generation of people, in fact I'm going to say most everybody in this building, but perhaps me and the Clarks, have little remembrance of all of this taking place. Some no remembrance of it. And so I need to explain to you briefly what I am talking about. Under the umbrella of the Restoration movement throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, there were efforts toward centralization or joint cooperation of churches. And what I mean by that, as you can see illustrated on this chart, is that there were local churches who pooled their funds in a human organization to do the work that they themselves were given to do. Generally speaking, these cooperation efforts covered the whole spectrum of church work. For example, in evangelism, there was the Herald of Truth, and in edification, or in benevolence, there was the Tennessee Orphan Home, and a number of other orphan homes. And then in edification, there was Abilene Christian College, Oklahoma Christian College, Freed Hardeman, David Lipscomb. These are just few of the prominent efforts that I am mentioning here. And good conscientious brethren, sound men, arose to oppose these centralization and cooperation efforts. On December the 9th, 1954, the Gospel Advocate, who at that time was the most powerful and widely read paper among brethren, under the editorship of a man by the name of B.C. Goodpastor, published the following letter that I'm going to read at least a portion of it to you. Before I do that, however, let me say this. We're living in a day and time of social media. Anybody who wants to be can be an author. All you got to do is just get up some friends on social media who are not really your friends at all, and you can print something and they'll read it. So everybody has become to some extent an author. It's hard to kind of imagine in our generation, for the younger people especially, how powerful that Brotherhood magazines were several years ago. Now, there's only one or two. I don't think there's a single one still actually in print today. There's two of them that I think printed among conservative brethren that are published as PDFs each month. But as far as I know, there's none actually that are in print. Truth Magazine, well, no, they stopped printing theirs too. So there is no print magazine out there. They're all e-zines, what they call e-zines, e-magazines. So it's kind of hard for us to understand what it would have been like when you didn't have social media. Communication was a whole lot different. And these magazines wielded a lot of power. Other institutions particularly of higher learning, wielded a lot of influence among brethren, far more than what you see now. But again, we'll go back to B.C. Goodpastor and the Gospel Advocate, and here is a letter that he printed. He said, this letter said, "Dear Brother Goodpastor, for a considerable length of time, many members of the church believed the controversy would soon end over the question of the attitude our congregation should assume towards supporting orphan homes and radio programs in cooperation with other churches, and no serious results would follow. However, we were mistaken. It now appears to me and to others that instead of coming to an end, the cleavage grows more pronounced, and another dangerous division, similar to the premillennial division, is sure to come unless a strong and aggressive, specific attack is made upon the theories and methods of those men who are responsible for this threatened division. The exposure of such men may yet prevent many congregations from being disturbed and divided. Premillennialism was practically stopped when those responsible for teaching and pressing their hurtful theories were publicly quarantined. I trust you will not consider me presumptuous if I suggest that perhaps the writers of the Gospel Advocate might wisely spearhead a movement to quarantine those preachers who today are sowing the seeds of discord among the brotherhood, and to thus prevent further divisions." And it was signed fraternally. Well, that letter became known as the yellow tag of quarantine. Now, let me say this. It's difficult for a millennial generation, much less, and to say nothing about the Gen Z, Gen X generation, people who were born before the advent of modern medicine. It's different to imagine the stigma of a yellow tag of quarantine placed on the door of your house at the presence of such diseases as smallpox, tuberculosis, cholera, and influenza. You heard a lot about the Spanish flu that took place in the early 1900s when we had COVID, right? You heard a lot about that. And you see, under COVID, we quarantined. In fact, it was really almost a worldwide quarantine. A lot of bad things happened during that time. But what it didn't do is it did not quarantine, particularly because we had social media. It really didn't quarantine one person from another, okay? You still had association with the people that you knew and you loved the most, the people who were in your circle. That was different when government would come, in the early 1900s, they knew you had flu in your house, they would quarantine you in your house. And sometimes when families died, houses were burned and things of this nature in order to try to destroy or stop that epidemic. So it's kind of hard for us to remember that and to think about when he said that some people ought to be quarantined, a yellow tag of quarantine put on these people. People need to know that that was a right difficult thing. There were many preachers like myself. I wasn't affected by this except a little later. There were many preachers who opposed church support of benevolent homes. They opposed such things as the Herald of Truth. They were fired from the pulpits that they occupied almost immediately after the yellow tag of quarantine. They not only fired, but there were gospel meetings that had been planned, and they were canceled from good men. And not only that, but there were close friends, there were close families. They were actually separated because of this division. And today, to this very day, churches that are tagged as institutional and non-institutional or conservative and liberal have very little to say or to do with one another because basically they quarantine people like me. That's what happened. They quarantined us. Now, my purpose in this lesson is to kind of reflect on this controversy. I am not a historian or the son of one. I do love church history. But and in fact, I was born in 1953. I was born about 18 months prior to this yellow tag of quarantine presented. But I grew up in all of that. I grew up in the heat of that debate that went all the way into and through the 60s, actually into the early 70s in some part of this country before it was completely sealed. And I remember my concepts of Bible authority was formed by men who would get up and preach against institutionalism. They would preach on Bible authority and the need for Bible authority and the consistency in applying Bible authority. And I grew up, that formed my concept of Bible authority, and I don't apologize for that. I appreciate the men. In fact, I haven't heard yet, but the man who had probably the most influence on me is a man named Jackie Richardson. He baptized me into Jesus Christ. He's in the Huntsville Hospital right now. My wife and I went and visited him on Friday, and it looks like that he probably won't get out of the hospital. But anyway, that's sad. That's heartbreaking for me, especially the thought that I might not be able to attend his funeral because I'm up here. But I will tell you this. If he knew where I was and what I was doing, this is exactly where he would want me to be. I know that. So men like that formed my views of these things, and I am forever grateful that they did. So to put the institutional question in perspective, what I've got to do is I've got to talk about God's plan for the organization of the church. When you come to the New Testament, in the first century, Jesus told his disciples, go into all the world, preach the gospel to every creature, right? Mark 16 and verse 15, you know that very well. And from Acts chapter 2, they did. They went from Judea into Samaria and to the remotest parts of the earth, went carrying the gospel message. And when they did, especially you begin reading Paul's missionary journeys beginning in Acts chapter 13, when they did, they went carrying the gospel, and they went into different communities, and when there would be people who would obey the gospel, they would form a local church. And those local churches were organized at God's direction under an eldership. There were preachers and teachers to teach. There were deacons to serve. There were other members to grow and mature as time and opportunity would allow. And this is the way, this is the framework under which these men work and these churches were formed. And the unity of these local churches was to be carefully guarded. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 10, when Paul said that he did not want any divisions among you, he was not talking about the divisions that may be there between us and denominational structures, those denominational structures would come many years later. He was just talking about division within local churches, not division among local churches now. He was talking about divisions within local churches. There's application for, or there's possibility for broader application of that principle, but still, that's what he was talking about. Now I want to reflect for just a moment, and I think this is important. In fact, this is so important that I'm going to mention this, I think, at least 2 other times. We're going to go through this because I want this to be indelibly printed on the minds of even the youngest people. When you think about the organization of the local church, the first thing I want you to think about is God's organization reflects God's divine purpose for the church. You know, when God designs something, He designs it for a purpose. Now, let's reflect back for just a moment on how that God designed the universe. You know, God designed, and not just the universe, how that He designed this terrestrial orb upon which we live. He designed it in a very special way for human habitation. And when He created it, it was a perfect environment for man to grow and develop. Now, we're not going to spend time talking about the introduction of sin and how we live in a sin-cursed world, but from different standpoints, I just want to point out that we're just the right distance from the sun. The rotation of the earth is just the right rotation. If it was any less, we would be flung out into space. If it was any more, we'd be crushed under the weight of gravity. All of these things reflect that God created this world and gave it design. And that design was for a purpose. When God created the church, when He designed the local church, He designed it with a purpose. And so that design is fit and perfectly sufficient to accomplish the purpose that God gave it to do. And so when we look at that, we think that there are bishops, there are elders, shepherds. They reflect the word of edification. They're to oversee the flock of God. Deacons reflect the work of God, specifically the work of benevolence you see in Scripture. They're servants of this local church. And then there are elders, and there are teachers and evangelists who reflect the word of both evangelism, the work of both evangelism and edification. We're going to talk more about the work of the church in our afternoon session. But this organization was designed for this specific purpose. And God made that organization sufficient to do what He designed it to do. There's nothing else needed. It is sufficient to do. Now, another thing that's important that we see is that it is self-governing. In Acts 14, verse 23, the Bible tells us that Paul ordained elders in every church. That's God's plan, for there to be elders in every church. And 1 Peter 5 and verse 2 says that those elders will oversee the flock of God which is among you. Now, I happen to be one of the elders, one of the shepherds for the South Cullman Church, and I have been for maybe 15 years, been there about 18, so 15, 16 years ago they appointed me to serve as one of their shepherds. But I will say this, even though I am a shepherd, I'm not here today in that capacity, because I have no right as a shepherd to interfere in the work of the church here in Grinnell, Iowa. No right whatsoever. Now, when it comes to the work at South Cullman, me and my fellow shepherds have the responsibility to oversee the work at South Cullman, not Grinnell, Iowa, because each church is self-governing. You guys are self-governing. No one has a right to come along and impose upon you something that you do not want. You have the right to govern yourselves. That's what happened in the Scriptures. Each eldership governed each local church. And that said, what this does is it tells us that each local church was independent. There are no organizational ties between churches. Now, we all share a common faith. We all share a common work to do. We all share a common organization which we desire to aspire to within the framework of that local church. But we are completely independent of one another. I had a conversation with a guy several years ago. He says, how in the world do y'all do that? How do you decide where you want to move to preach and things like this without some overseeing organization to guide you and direct you in that? I said, well, we do it quite fine. I've been doing it for over 50 years now, so I've never lacked for a place to preach. I've always found somebody who wanted to listen to me, or at least would let me preach for them. So that works out good. In the New Testament, each local church collected its own resources, made its own decisions, engaged in its own work, and they were equal to each other. That's just simply to say that one was not better than the other, okay? That's not, if one may have a larger number, one may have a larger building, a larger bank account, a larger capacity to do work, but it doesn't make any difference because we're all equal to one another. One church is not better than the other. Now, this is the pattern for the New Testament church. And again, we're going to come back to this. I may say it so many times that it's going to bore you, but I do it for emphasis. This is the pattern for the New Testament church we see in the first century. But it wasn't long in the history of the church before that began to change. In fact, the apostles saw and foretold of a general falling away from the faith, a general apostasy in places like 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and 1 Timothy chapter 4 and 2 Timothy chapter 4. And so there were a number of different places where the Scriptures actually foresaw an apostasy. And throughout the first 250 years or so, there were false teachers that would arise that would bring serious challenge to among New Testament churches. And it's kind of ironic that it was the local church's response to those false teachers that actually led to the corruption, the organization of the church. And I want to just kind of put a pin in that right there for just a second. Any division that has ever happened among the Lord's people, that has been general in its nature at least, is because someone tried to corrupt the organization of the church. It's always been that way. There's a lot of unique issues that have come up within local churches that have divided local churches through the years. But if there is a general division among brethren, it always is over the organization of the church. So, as we've already noted, the New Testament pattern of local church organization was that each church have its own plurality of elders. No one elder possessed any authority or right to rule above the others. And then the rule of local churches was invested in that local eldership. Let me say this. We've got 3 elders at South Cullman right now. I have no authority, no more authority than any other brother in that church. Okay? God's authority is invested not in a single elder. It's invested in an eldership. That's why there is a plurality of elders in every church. But about 150 AD, the concept of a monarchical episcopate was developed. What happened is, in their meetings to discuss these heresies that I was talking about a few minutes ago from these false teachers, usually someone had to chair a meeting. And then that chairmanship became permanent, and they actually reserved for that man alone the title of bishop within a local church. And about 150 AD, the concept of that monarchical episcopate was complete. And later, that presiding elder or bishop of a city was considered to be over all of the different churches in an area. And so what happened is a diocese was formed. A general organization of churches was formed. Now, it was determined that city bishop would give instruction and the rules for these smaller churches to keep all of this heresy down. And so in the ensuing years, bishops began to meet together to discuss their mutual problems, and then a presiding council was selected, and ultimately a leading bishop was chosen. And this idea continued to grow until by the end of the 3rd century, there were 5 leading bishops called patriarchs that ruled much of the church. And those 5 men were, one was in Alexandria, another one was in Jerusalem, another was in Antioch, another was in Constantinople, another was in Rome. And then even among this episcopate organization at that point in time, people started wrestling for control. particularly between Constantinople and Rome. And that was a bitter division that happened over many years. And finally, then, these regional councils decided that the Roman bishop was going to rule over. And so what happened is you have the formation then of the Roman Catholic Church and the papacy. And it is hard to imagine how much control that these men would have over the next few years. In fact, from the 5th through the 15th century, the Catholic Church grew more and more powerful. They were politically corrupt, they were morally corrupt, and these were what was called the Dark Ages. You've heard people talk about the Dark Ages, when the Catholic Church exercised control over absolutely every aspect of your life. They control the arts, they control science, they control religion, they even control politics. And the church would not tolerate any dissent whatsoever. If there was a dissenter, he was excommunicated, or either he was executed in some cases for questioning the authority of the Pope. And the Bible remained a sealed book. It was not in the hands of the common man. The only ones who had the right to interpret what God had said was the priest. People like me and you would have had no opportunity. And then at the beginning, somewhere around 1330, but particularly in the 15th and 16th centuries, you had men like John Wycliffe and William Tyndale, Martin Luther, Ulrich Zwingli, John Calvin, John Smith, John Wesley. The work of these men actually blessed the world. They really brought about a big change, because these men believed that the Bible, not the church, should be their rule of faith. In fact, there was a term that was coined, sola scriptura. And that point just simply was to say that the Scriptures and not the church was the sole standard of divine authority. The priest didn't have a right to tell you what the Scriptures taught, only the Bible did. And of course, this was helped when Johannes Gutenberg established the printing press and then put the Bible into the hands of the common men. And when that happened, just everything broke loose as far as people seeking to reform the Catholic Church. And that's what these men were trying to do in the very beginning, especially these earliest reformers. But what they argued in principle, they violated in practice, because many of them began to write their own statements of faith, their creeds that were adopted by their followers. And the question of what the Bible taught about centralization and human institutionalism never seemed to come front and center. It just never was something that became an issue with them. And that's evidenced by the fact that later on, either they or their followers would establish these denominational hierarchies, and give them their names, and here are some of them when they were founded. But then we're going to move a little bit later into the middle 17 and 1800s. When, by the time 1700 came along, there were men in this country, and some even in Europe, who began to realize what was going on. And perhaps in response to European secular rationalism, it would be called modernism. In response to that, there was what was called a second Great Awakening, actually. It was a Great Awakening that took place here in this country. And this began to sweep our country. Revivals among every group, and certainly it was ecumenical in their nature. In communities, there would be revivals where Calvinism pretty much would be preached, but hellfire and brimstone sermons were preached everywhere, and people were brought to a greater knowledge of God. Most of them were highly influenced by John Calvin. Most all of them were. But some of these men began to insist that believers in Christ should abandon all denominational doctrines and names and patterns of worship and call for a "Thus saith the Lord" in all doctrine, faith, and practice. Some of these men's names are really forever etched in human history, and I've got them listed here: James O'Kelly, Thomas Alexander, Campbell, Walter Scott, Barton Warren Stone, and Raccoon John Smith, and Jacob Kreth. By the way, If you've never read the histories of these men or a biography of these men, I'd encourage you to do it. I'd encourage you actually to begin with Earl West's 4-volume work. Read the first 2 volumes. The 3rd and 4th volume are not worth the paper they're written on, but the first 2 are incredible. The first 2 are incredibly good, and they're called The Search for the Ancient Order, and I would encourage everybody to read those. It'll tell you something about, at least historically, our background. And then gradually those who followed this restorationist idea, they formed congregations separate from their denominational neighbors and began to put these principles into practice. They referred to themselves as Christian churches or disciples of Christ. And these churches mirrored the New Testament church's pattern of organization and worship. They were just like what you read about in the New Testament, just as I think we are today. And these congregations grew at a rapid pace, and the membership grew at an unprecedented rate. But then, even from amidst the ranks of the Restoration, there were men who began to argue that the local church itself could not accomplish the great work that Jesus intended it to do, particularly when it came to missionary work. Some of these men wanted to send a missionary to Jerusalem, from whence the gospel had originally come. That was the first question. And no one church could do it, because no one church had the money that it would take in order to be able to do it. So they thought there needed to be some kind of organization or machinery set in place to get that work done. Later, a man by the name of J.B. Briney, and in defense of the Missionary Society, here's what he said. When a thing is commanded to be done, the method of doing it is not prescribed. Those commanded are at liberty to use their best judgment in devising ways and means to carry out the command. Well, I'm going to be charitable, Mr. Briney, and say this, that his mistake was in the fact that he misunderstood the real basis of his opposition's argument. To say that he ignored it would be cast disparagement upon him, and I don't really want to do that. I just want to say that he was mistaken, because the objection to the missionary society was not about which method was used in evangelism, but who was to do the work in the first place. That was the objection. It wasn't an objection over method or means to accomplish the work of evangelism, but what organization was to do it. And you see, they established the American Christian Missionary Society in 1849 in Cincinnati, Ohio, to send the gospel back to Jerusalem. But they felt like they had to do it through a human organization. That was the problem. And this concept of centralized control and oversight in the work of evangelism resulted in that very society. The real problem here is that the establishment of the American Christian Missionary Society was in essence an effort to try to mobilize the universal church. See, God never gave the universal church a work to do, nor the means by which it should do it. God never gave it organization, only the local church. And the same attitude, by the way, that led to the attitude toward authority, that led to the establishment of the American Christian Missionary Society, also led to the introduction a few years later of the instrument of music by L.L. Pinkerton in Midway, Kentucky in the year 1860. That's when that developed. So, I said all of that to get here, and that is the 1906 U.S. Religious Census for the first time listed the Churches of Christ and the Disciples of Christ as separate and distinct groups. But that was only following a development that had been taking more than 20 years. It had already been taking place for about 20 years. All of these had been hashed out in local places, and this division had been coming for a long time. Finally, it was just recognized by our government. And as the dust settled with the American Christian Missionary Society and the Instrumental Music Division, you had the formation of the Christian church, and the separation was complete. Of course, most everybody went with the Disciples of Christ. Usually, in every division like this, the money and the numbers are going to go with the more liberal people. That's just the way it is. Money numbers always go with the liberal people. The churches of Christ at this particular point in 1900 were few and small. Yater Tant would say that there were probably less than 12 full-time preachers, a lot more churches than that, but less than 12 full-time preachers in our country. People who were paid to do nothing more than preach. A lot of the men who preached were bivocational preachers. They made their living farming in most cases, but they continued to preach for years and years. And despite these discouraging numbers between 1900 and 1950, these were years of tremendous growth among churches of Christ. Preachers like Foy Wallace, N.B. Hardeman, G.C. Brewer, J.D. Tant, Joe Warlick, and H. Leo Bowles, they became household names during that time. They were the ones who wrote for the papers, those all-powerful papers back then. They wrote for those papers. And some sources say that the number of Christians came close to 500,000 right there very quickly. And the message was spreading not only in the deep South, we call the South the Bible Belt, and there's some reason for that. And if that's the case, by the way, Cullman, Alabama is the belt buckle, okay, if it's the Bible Belt. But the gospel also spread in places like Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, all the way out to West Coast. And so there was a widespread. And then the development of such things like radio and the invention of the automobile, air travel, began to fuel the spread of the gospel. And during this time, there were a lot of parachurch organizations that were growing, colleges and schools. Nashville Bible School became David Lipscomb University. Harding College settled in Searcy, Arkansas, after having actually traveled around. Pepperdine was out in California. Abilene Christian, or at least the first part of it, was established. And what that means is that there were these institutions of higher learning all the way across the country. And then you had benevolent institutions. The first one was Tennessee Children's Home in Spring Hill, Tennessee. Tennessee Orphan Home it was called then, later Tennessee Children's Home. And it still exists now, but I don't know if that's the name of it or not. But there were a lot of others, Potter in Kentucky and Bowles. I think Bowles was in Texas, if I remember correctly. Tipton in Oklahoma in 1928. And Cullman actually had one called Child Haven, still in existence today. Now, in these times, there were some significant but minor skirmishes. There was pacifism and premillennialism, but there was real little change. Leonard Allen, there were a lot of religious debates, by the way, during this time, and these religious debates sometimes developed into conversions of whole denominational groups. And there were gospel meetings that would take place, and these gospel meetings were attended like community events, and people from all over, without regard to the denominations they attend, would come and hear faithful brethren preach, and they'd be converted in some cases by the tens and the 50s and the hundreds. It was a wonderful time as far as the spread of the gospel is concerned. A man by the name of Leonard Allen, one other word here, kind of as an aside. All of the quotes, and I believe all of them, if there's an exception to that, I'll make note of it later. But all of the quotes that I'm going to give you are quotes that came from men who later became institutional or liberal. And the reason I'm going to give you these quotes from these men is to show you how that over a period of maybe 15 to 20 years, there was a great shift in the thinking of these very men. And I think it's important to recognize. There was a shift in their thinking. Not in the thinking of men like myself, but in their thinking. Leonard Allen said there was a time when churches of Christ were known as people of the book. All who knew us knew that we hungered above all for the Word of God. They knew that we immersed ourselves in its truth and sacrificed dearly to share the gospel with those who had never heard. These were our most fundamental commitments. We knew it, and others knew it. And years later, a man by the name of Willard Collins, he came to live in his old age in Lawrenceburg, Tennessee, where I was living at the time. Willard Collins says, I don't think, he's comparing what was happening in our day and time with what was happening then. He said, I don't think they see the glory of the church, talking about people sometimes preaching today, unencumbered by denominationalism as I did. When I was growing up, I don't think members of the church think the church is, hey, when I was growing up, stop that quotation there. And then he says, I don't think members of the church think the church is different from Protestantism. That's today. When I started preaching, members of the church believed Protestants needed to be saved. We've lost a lot of that. It goes back to an understanding of the distinctiveness of the church. At an earlier time, they really felt the gospel was a lot better than Protestantism. And then a man by the name of G.K. Wallace, who died a few years ago, said most of the baptisms were from denominations. In those days, denominational people would come to our meetings. Denominational people do not come these days to our meetings, and if they would, and if they did, they would not, in most cases, hear anything that would lead them out of false doctrine. And you know that is the truth. Listen to the lessons that are preached by preachers in gospel meetings today that you've heard. Is there much there that's going to lead people out of denominationalism? I think what happens is, as preachers, and there's some rational justification for this, as preachers, what we do is we preach to the needs of the people that are in front of us. And I think that's really important, okay? It's important to do that. But it's also important to preach lessons that show how that we are distinct from the religious world around us. And it's also important when people come, we do have those people that we invite to come and be a part, for them to hear something that is distinctive in its message, to show them that we've got something that the rest of the denominational world don't have. It's really important for that. And so, other factors were at work, although at the Abilene, there were several things, several factors were giving a foretaste of what was going to happen. I'll get to this quote in just a minute. Several colleges had been quietly accepting contributions during these years. In fact, people who went to the Abilene Christian College lectures in 1938 believed they heard G.K. Wallace to say this, that the church that did not have Abilene Christian College in its budget had the wrong preacher. That's what he said. A decade later, N.B. Hardeman and others revived that controversy, and they began to push for churches to get involved in the support of colleges from their treasuries. The way they did that was that most of the people that listened to them preach had already come to believe that it was okay to support orphan asylums from the church budget. And they met, in fact, I have a personal record of a man who was actually in a conversation between N.B. Hardeman and A.G. Freed. And they heard them say, what we've got to do is we've got to get people to see that support of the orphan home and support of the college stand and fall together. See, there were a lot of people who believed it was okay to support the orphan home, but very few believed that it was okay to support a college. And so these two men, very powerful men, spiritually speaking, said, we've got to get together. And we've got to show people how that those organizations stand and fall together if we're going to survive as colleges. But it's then that Brother Guy Woods wrote this. He said, the ship of Zion has floundered more than once on the sandbar of institutionalism. And he said, this is in 1939 Abilene Christian College lectures, that all such organizations usurp the work of the church and are unnecessary and sinful. This is Guy Woods who said this. Later he said in the annual lesson commentary, he said, we should be highly suspicious of any scheme that requires the setting up of an organization independent of the church in order to accomplish its work. The church is the only organization authorized to discharge the responsibilities of the Lord's people. And guess what? He was absolutely right. But Guy Woods and the Gospel Advocate would later become the leading factor in taking churches into institutionalism. Then we come to World War II. I'm going to end up infringing on a little bit of your time for this lesson. We'll give it back at some point in time. World War II was a watershed event, not just for our country, but for spiritual people too. See, part of the problem is that sometimes we think as churches of Christ that we exist in a vacuum, but we don't. In fact, Lance and I have already been talking about this a little bit this morning. Culture affects us in a lot of different ways. And you know that if culture affects the world, if culture changes, we're going to see the effects of those changes one way or another in the church. Some of it might not be for bad, but a lot of it is. And for several reasons, you see a lot of this changing taking place. You see an older generation of people who, preachers who took strong stand on Bible principles, and they started passing from the scene one by one. In just a matter of an 18-month period, men like Daniel Summer, J.D. Tant, and Joe Warlick and F.B. Shrigley died, and that left younger men to fill their place, particularly as editors of journals. Attitudes toward the war itself brought about some changes. There had been a strong minority, mainly through and under the influence of David Lipscomb, that said that Christians should not participate in civil government at all, much less in the war. They were pacifists. David Lipscomb wrote a book. I'd encourage you to get it and read it. I think there's more to be said for what he presents than what we sometimes pass him off too easily. But he was an entire pacifist. He didn't think Christians even ought to vote. And so it's important maybe to read what he had to say. During World War I, we'll go back to World War I, the Cordell Christian College was closed by a local defense council. And there were two young students, young Christians, who were threatened with execution for their pacifist beliefs. So during World War I, if you were a pacifist, you were not very popular at all. I mean, it was bitter toward you. But World War II produced a different mood and a strong patriotism, because the Japanese made the mistake of bombing Pearl Harbor. And that brought our patriotism front and foremost and changed Christians' attitude, for the most part, toward pacifism. But something else happened, and this is critical. B.C. Goodpasture closed the pages of the Gospel Advocate to any discussion of the war question. He said, here we are in the midst of this war. We're not going to discuss the war question and the doctrine of pacifism at all. And this was more reliable. This was from the Gospel Advocate. This was from a magazine that David Lipscomb himself had founded. We're not going to talk about it anymore. I get the rationale behind it. You're in the middle of a war. I understand the rationale. But the middle of the next decade, by the middle of the next decade, the pages of this same influential journal were closed to any discussion of the issues that divided brethren. I could not have a voice in it at that time. Then you have, we've come pretty much full circle now to division over the institutionalism of sponsoring church arrangement. Because when GIs came back from the war, evangelistic fervor was high. Churches and brethren seemed to be willing to try whatever sounded good to spread the gospel. Thousands of GIs were going to college on the GI Bill, and these Christian colleges didn't want to be left behind, and so if they wanted government funding, you know, they got involved in the same thing. And so here we go. We want to take the gospel to the whole world, and that's really good. And so with good intentions, churches were inundated with appeals to support cooperative works in Germany, Italy, and so many other places. And these works were overseen by churches like churches in Tennessee and Texas, who assumed centralized control over the work done in these countries. And so that began the concept of the sponsoring church arrangement. We'll talk more about that, I think, on Tuesday night. But out of that, the Herald of Truth was born. Opposition that some sound brethren issued was led by people like Roy Cogdell, Luther Blackman, Yater Tant, and others like that. Even Foy Wallace had published the Bible Banner in 1949. He closed its pages and then established the Gospel Guardian with Yater Tant as its editors. And it was established with a view toward battling the institutional issues and the sponsoring church. The Herald of Truth was looked upon as the voice of churches of Christ by the mainline churches. Much was said about the Lutherans having the Lutheran hour, the Catholic having the Catholic hour. Why don't we have our hour? And so the Herald of Truth was born. Actually, it was born in an environment that would not have been wrong in and of itself, because what the church was going to do is produce tapes and then let these tapes be sent out to the various churches. Herald of Truth is going to do their work, send the tapes out. The churches may have to pay for the tapes themselves, but it was going to go into all the world. And so that would not have been an unscriptural concept. But it turned into something different. It turned into a situation where churches started sending their monies by the scores and even by the hundreds to this Herald of Truth in order to actually produce the program for everyone. And then you add to the list not only the Herald of Truth, but a lot of other parachurch organizations too. And then opposition began to develop in religious journals and in pulpits. I mentioned Foy Wallace a few moments ago. Glenn Wallace questioned the Herald of Truth in the Gospel Guardian in 1953. And then there were other papers that began to publish articles questioning these practices. By that time, you had papers like Truth Magazine and Searching the Scriptures, and Preceptor in Texas, and just a bunch of other organs that actually produced this opposition. But then here were the arguments. The argument simply is that God has revealed patterns in Scripture, patterns that we are to follow. And these patterns are expressed, as we're going to talk about in the next hour, in terms of direct statements and examples and implications. And that generic statements or commands will allow for expedience, all ways of obeying, while the specific directions are more restrictive and don't allow us to add to or take from. Then differences between generic and specific instruction are to be understood by simply common sense principles of interpretation. We talked about how that there's a difference between what an individual can do and what a church can do, and how that the church treasury is to be used for purposes of edification of its members, assisting saints who are in need, and supporting preachers as the ability will be able to allow in their proclamation of the gospel. That there was no authority in Scripture for human organizations supported by churches to do the work of those churches. Wasn't any authority for that. There is no authority to provide recreation or social activities for its members. We'll talk about that tonight. We argued that human organizations like publishing houses, colleges, they may provide services on a fee-for-service basis, but not as an appendage to the church. And that individual churches are not composed of, do not compose the universal church, but that the universal church is composed of people, of individuals. That's important for us to see. And that there is no provision in Scripture for the universal church to even collectively function, because it's the relationship of people rather than a structural organization. And so those were kind of the issues during that time, some of which we're going to flesh out a little bit later. The main organs supporting these institutions were the Gospel Advocate under the editorship of B.C. Goodpastor, and Firm Foundation under the editorship of a man by the name of Rule Lemons. And so now what we've done is we've come full circle. And we've come back to that statement that was made in the Gospel Advocate back in 1954. The writers of the Gospel Advocate might wisely spearhead a movement to quarantine those preachers, and so they issued the yellow tag of quarantine. Well, that was a yellow tag quarantine against me and probably 99 9/10% of the people that you hear preach from time to time. They quarantined us. And like he had done earlier on the war question, B.C. Goodpastor actually closed the pages of the Advocate to opposing views on institutionalism of the sponsoring church. I was in a meeting, I think it was in 16, I'll come to that in just a second, at the offices of the Gospel Advocate, asked to come there by Greg Tidwell, who was the editor of the Advocate, and I have developed somewhat of a friendship with him, even though we're not in fellowship. And he told me that the pages of the Advocate were once closed to people like me. He said, no longer. He said, you want to write an article for the Gospel Advocate, you write it, I'll publish it. if it fits within the framework what they're trying to do. And so in the ensuing years, after the division and that yellow tag quarantine was issued, there were a lot of debates. This is just 5 of the more prominent ones. There were tons of debates over the institutional issues, and there were untold private discussions. But the deed was already done. The separation was complete. Brethren who once stood together for the common faith, brethren who were friends, and sometimes family members were and are now on opposite sides of the issues, and we have little or no communication. Little or no communication. So that brings us to today. Where do things stand today? There have been a number of different meetings. I want to highlight some of them for you here. There's been the Arlington meeting in 1968. In fact, you can buy from any of the Brotherhood bookstores a copy of the Arlington meeting, because all of the speeches were published in that. And that's really a good book. And I'm going to tell you that most of the arguments that the institutional people made at that time are no longer arguments that most of the institutional preachers make. They've drifted away from that. Most of them will say that the Bible is not, most of them don't even believe that the Bible is inerrant anymore. Most of them will question even the text of the Bible in some cases. But most of them will also say, you want us to have authority? We don't have to have authority. There's no need for authority anymore, is what they'll say. I highlight that 2012. Actually, it would go back to 2016 at Gospel Advocate Office meeting with Greg Tidwell. I thought that was really a change. Now, I'd like, in 2020, they discontinued, during the COVID, they discontinued the paper and haven't picked it back up again. I talked with Greg just a couple of days ago about if he still was the Gospel Advocate editor. He said, I'm still on payroll. But he's got 6 issues of the Gospel Advocate ready to be printed, but they've stopped it. And if they are printed, they'll probably be printed PDF and sent out, would be my guess. Growing out of that 2016, dropped down to number 6 now, I had a conference in Cullman, Alabama on the things over which we differed. And it became really clear that even though there's the lot of problems that are taking place within institutionalism right now, with all those churches going progressive, that we still don't have a whole lot in common with what used to be the mainline group. We still don't have anything in common with them. We did another one in 2018, and I did this because we wanted to focus on some things that we agreed on, particularly with regard to how that they approached the issues of progressivism that they were opposing. And what that made clear is that the only difference between the institutional mainline churches and the progressive churches is just where they're willing to stop. There is no, as far as Bible authority is concerned, there's not a nickel's worth of difference between them. They're still where they were. And then there was a public discussion between Doug Burleson and Kyle Pope on November 15th. Doug preaches for, or actually teaches at Freed-Hardeman College. I think he's head of the Bible department. And it would be, to your advantage, I guess, you can go out there on Truth Magazine's website, probably find that video, because it was streamed live and it is still there. But it's, as we look at where things are today, the division remains between the institutional and non-institutional churches. The big division that's taking place now is between those who were conservative institutional and those who've gone progressive. Those who've gone progressive will embrace women being used in public service. They will embrace not just women, but the instrumental music. And they'll embrace what has really been defined by John Mark Hicks, who I think he was head of the Bible department at David Lipscomb. I think he's retired now. But they embrace what they call a theological hermeneutic rather than pattern theology. They embrace what's called a theological hermeneutic, which he's already wrote a book following the book that he taught on that, for the full inclusion of women in worship services. That's where he's going with all of that. And so they've got a battle that they're undergoing, and they're losing that battle by the way. And that leaves us with the idea that there's really not a lot of hope for any kind of a development of unity. There are people who, I think by the droves, are coming out of these liberal churches because the preaching that they're hearing is not the preaching that their grandparents heard and their parents heard. And so some of them are really looking for something, and we found a lot in common with those people, and they found a lot in common with us. And so we have several in our ranks who've left institutionalism and come to worship with us. So anyway, that gives you a framework for some of the things we're going to say this week, and I hope it'll be beneficial to you. Our next lesson is going to be on authority. This evening we're going to talk about the work of the church, what the work of the church is, and hopefully that'll be able to draw all of these specific issues into clear mindset for you. Again, if you have any question at all, you want to talk with me about anything, feel free to let me know, and I'll be glad to talk to you about them. Thank you.